The Fear You Can't Escape, a Hospital Mystery. It was a quiet night at St. Mary's Hospital, a building nestled in the outskirts of a small town, far enough from the city lights that the night sky was always so dark it felt like it could swallow you whole. The hospital had been in operation for over a century, and though its walls were thick with the weight of history, they were equally filled with whispers of strange occurrences, sightings, and unexplainable events. As the clock struck midnight, a storm began to roll in. The wind howled and the rain hammered against the windows with an intensity that made the whole building seem like it might crumble under the pressure. Yet, inside, everything was eerily still. The night shift was in full swing, and Nurse Clara was making her rounds. She had worked here for 5 years and had heard all the rumors, all the ghost stories about the hospital, but she had always brushed them aside as the result of too much late-night talk among staff. Tonight, however, something felt different. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. As she entered room 37, she found the patient, Mr. Teller, staring blankly at the ceiling. His body was frail, his skin almost translucent, and his breathing shallow. The man had been in a coma for weeks, the doctors unable to figure out the cause. Every time they tried a new treatment, he seemed to worsen, yet nothing was working. It was as though something was actively fighting against the healing. "Good evening, Mr. Teller," Clara whispered softly, checking his vitals. The moment her fingers brushed his wrist, a chill shot through her. The room temperature dropped, and she felt a strange, heavy sensation in the air. It was as though the shadows in the corners of the room were alive, moving, waiting. Suddenly, Mr. Teller's eyes snapped open. Clara gasped and took a step back, but his gaze was not one of recognition. His eyes were dark, black as coal, and they didn't blink. A raspy whisper escaped his lips, "They are coming for you." Clara froze. What did he mean? The hair on the back of her neck stood on end, and her heart pounded in her chest. She was about to call for help when the lights flickered, and the air seemed to grow even colder. Then, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hall. She turned, expecting to see a doctor or another nurse, but the hallway was empty. No one was there. Her pulse raced as she backed away from Mr. Teller's bed, her eyes never leaving him. His chest rose and fell, but it was as if he wasn't truly there, as if he was a hollow shell. The silence grew louder, more oppressive, as the clock ticked on. Suddenly, the door to the room slammed shut with a deafening bang. Clara spun around, her breath catching in her throat. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch, twisting, as if they were alive. A soft voice, almost imperceptible, whispered in her ear, "Get out." Her heart thudded wildly, and she rushed to the door, but it wouldn't open. It was locked, though she knew she hadn't locked it. She pulled and pulled at the handle, panic rising in her chest, her mind screaming for escape. Then, the whispers grew louder, echoing around her, filling her head. She could hear them, all of them, doctors, patients, and something else, something darker, something older. "Help us," they chanted, voices overlapping and distorting, merging into one unholy sound. Clara spun around to find Mr. Teller sitting up in his bed now, his face twisted in an unnatural grin, his mouth too wide, his teeth too sharp. His eyes were hollow, nothing more than deep, empty voids. "They are here," he whispered, his voice barely a breath. The shadows were moving, slithering across the walls, crawling toward her. Her fingers trembled as she scrambled for her phone to call for help, but the screen flickered and went black. She was trapped. The temperature dropped even further, and she could see her breath in front of her. Then, a low growl filled the room. It was deep, rumbling, coming from all directions. Clara turned toward the source of the sound, and for the first time in her life, she truly feared what she saw. In the corner of the room, a figure emerged from the shadows, tall and gaunt, with hollow eyes and skin that seemed to ripple like smoke. Its mouth opened impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged, sharp teeth. "Clara!" The voice rasped, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. "You should have never come here." Her heart raced in her chest, her mind spiraling into terror. She realized with a sickening sense of dread that this place, this hospital, wasn't just a building. It was a prison. And whatever was lurking in its walls had been waiting for her. The figure lunged forward, its eyes locking onto hers, and she felt its cold breath on her skin. A scream built in her throat, but before she could let it out, the room went pitch black. The next morning, the hospital was silent. Clara was gone. No one ever spoke of her disappearance, but the staff would often notice the strange cold spots around room 37, the whispers that filled the empty halls, and the shadowy figures that seemed to flicker at the edges of their vision. Some patients would claim that when they closed their eyes, they could hear her voice, faint and distant, calling for help. The fear you can't escape isn't the one you face in the moment, it's the one that waits for you, lurking in the dark corners, biding its time. And sometimes, it's waiting inside the walls of the very places meant to protect us. The Lost Hiker, Voices in the Dark Forest. It was a crisp autumn afternoon when Ethan, an experienced hiker, set off into the dense forest that sprawled beyond the edge of his small town. His plan was simple, a quick trek to the peak for some breathtaking views and then back down before nightfall. The weather was perfect, cool, but not too cold, with just enough sunlight to keep the shadows at bay. Ethan had been hiking since he was a child. He knew these woods better than anyone. He had explored every inch of it, traversing through its winding paths and rugged hills. But there was one thing he never truly understood about the forest, its unsettling silence. The trees stood tall and ancient, their branches twisted like gnarled fingers, yet the air around them always felt oddly still. Even the wind seemed hesitant to disturb the leaves. But today, Ethan felt something different. As he ventured deeper, the woods grew thicker, the trees closer together, their branches intertwining, casting long shadows on the ground. A chill began to creep up his spine, but he shrugged it off. "It's just the weather," he muttered to himself, adjusting the straps on his backpack. Hours passed, and Ethan lost track of time. The sun, once high in the sky, began to dip below the horizon, and the forest around him seemed to darken, the shadows stretching longer and deeper. He hadn't noticed it before, but now, he realized, the familiar trail he had followed for years was gone. The path had vanished, replaced by a dense thicket of underbrush and tangled roots. Ethan stood still for a moment, his heart starting to race. His phone, which had been working perfectly earlier, now had no signal. Panic crept into his chest as he looked around, trying to get his bearings. The forest, which had once seemed like a sanctuary, now felt like a maze designed to trap him. As the last light of day faded into twilight, Ethan heard something that made his blood run cold, a soft whisper carried by the wind. At first, he thought it was his imagination, but then it came again, clearer this time, though still faint. "Help me!" Ethan's breath hitched. The voice was unmistakable, a desperate cry, trembling with fear. He spun around, but saw no one. The forest, as silent as ever, offered no answers. "Who's there?" Ethan called out, his voice shaking. No response. He strained his ears, listening intently. The whisper came again, this time closer. It wasn't just a voice, it was a plea, an echo of something long forgotten. Ethan's mind raced. The forest was older than anything he could understand. He had heard the local legends, the tales of hikers who disappeared without a trace, never to be seen again. Some said the forest was cursed, others claimed it was haunted. But Ethan had always dismissed them as superstitions. "Help me!" The voice was coming from deeper within the woods, farther away from the path. Despite every rational thought screaming at him to turn back, something pushed Ethan forward. He wasn't a coward. He had to know what was going on. He stepped cautiously, every crack of a twig beneath his boots making him flinch. The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to move, shifting like living things. He pressed on, heart hammering in his chest. The whisper now came in rapid succession, each word clearer than the last. "Please. I'm lost, in the dark, help me." Ethan's skin crawled as he recognized the voice. It was his own voice, his own words, echoing from the very depths of the forest. He stopped dead in his tracks. The voice was him, but it wasn't him. It was a distorted version of himself, one trapped in the very fabric of this forest. The air grew heavier, suffocating. He could barely breathe as he continued to follow the sound, until at last, he came to a clearing. In the center was a large, twisted tree, its bark blackened and charred, as if it had been burned by some ancient fire. Beneath it, there was a shallow pool of water, eerily still. The whispers ceased. The silence was deafening. Ethan stepped closer to the tree, his feet sinking into the soft earth beneath him. And then, something caught his eye, a reflection in the pool. He peered down, and his heart nearly stopped. The reflection was not his own. It was a figure shrouded in shadow, standing just behind him. Ethan whirled around, but there was nothing there. His breath quickened, panic rising in his chest. The figure in the water smiled, its face twisted, eyes hollow and black. It beckoned to him. Suddenly, the whispers returned, louder now, filling his ears. "Join us. Ethan. Join us." Before he could react, a cold hand grabbed his shoulder, spinning him around. But no one was there. He turned back to the pool, his reflection now smiling back at him, its grin wide and sinister. Ethan stumbled backward, his mind spinning. The forest was alive. It had always been alive, and it had been waiting for him. The ground beneath his feet trembled as the trees around him began to creak and moan, their branches twisting and writhing like serpents. The whispers turned into guttural chants, rising into a cacophony of eerie voices. The air thickened with a suffocating presence, and the very earth seemed to close in on him. Desperate, Ethan turned and ran, ignoring the branches that scratched at his skin, the roots that tried to trip him. His breath was ragged, his body aching, but he couldn't stop. He had to escape. But the forest wouldn't let him go. The path he had once known was now a maze of darkness, twisting and turning in impossible directions. The whispers followed him, growing louder and louder, until it felt like his very soul was being pulled into the forest's depths. Finally, after what felt like hours, Ethan collapsed to the ground, exhausted, his body trembling with fear. He looked around, trying to find any trace of the world he once knew. But there was nothing. The forest had consumed him. The last thing he heard before everything went silent was his own voice, echoing from the shadows, calling out to him. "Help me." And so, the legend of the lost hiker lived on. Many who entered the dark forest never returned, their voices forever trapped in its haunting depths, calling to those who dared to listen. Ethan was never seen again, but his voice, the voice that had once been so clear, was now just another whisper in the dark, waiting for the next hiker to heed its call. The shadow in the abandoned house, when fear becomes real. The sun had barely set in the small, quiet town of Alden, casting long shadows over the cracked pavement. The wind had picked up, causing the branches of nearby trees to sway, their leaves rustling like whispers in the air. The town's only street, Maple Street, was bathed in an eerie twilight. It was the perfect setting for the story of the old, abandoned house at the end of the street. The house had stood empty for over 20 years, ever since the last family mysteriously vanished without a trace. Since then, no one had dared to enter. The windows were broken, the paint peeled off the walls, and the front door hung crooked, almost as if it were beckoning anyone brave enough to step inside. But the rumors that surrounded the house were enough to keep the townsfolk far away. Whispers of strange lights in the windows, cold drafts that couldn't be explained, and shadows that moved by themselves. Tales of its haunting presence spread through the town like wildfire. Michael, a curious high school student with an adventurous spirit, had heard these stories all his life. The house intrigued him, but he'd never been brave enough to go inside. That is, until one fateful night. His friends dared him to spend the night there, to prove once and for all that the stories were just that, stories. "You won't last an hour," Carl, his best friend, teased. "I bet you'll run out screaming before the sun even goes down." Michael felt the challenge rise inside him. He wasn't one to back down from a dare, especially one as simple as spending a night in a spooky house. "I'll do it," he said, more to himself than to Carl. "I'm going to stay there all night." His friends laughed and made their bets. Carl's smirk was confident as Michael made his way to the front door of the house. The others stayed behind, watching from the safety of the street, their faces a mix of amusement and concern. The moment Michael stepped inside, the door creaked and slammed shut behind him, as if the house had been waiting for him. The air was thick with dust, and a cold, musty smell hit his nose. His flashlight beam cut through the gloom, revealing the decrepit state of the house. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, and the wooden floors groaned underfoot. He took a deep breath, trying to shake off the unease settling in his chest. The house was quiet, too quiet, but Michael pressed on. The light flickered slightly as he moved deeper into the house, exploring the ground floor. Every now and then, he thought he heard faint sounds, a rustle, a soft thud, but when he turned, there was nothing there. Minutes passed, then an hour. Nothing. The house remained silent, almost like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Michael chuckled to himself, trying to reassure himself that there was nothing to fear. After all, this was just an old house. There was no ghost. No shadow lurking in the dark. But then, he heard it. A soft shuffle. Michael froze, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. His flashlight flickered once again, casting shadows that seemed to twist and stretch unnaturally. He turned slowly, but there was no one behind him. Nothing but the darkness. His heart raced. He glanced toward the hallway at the far end of the room. In the dim light, he saw something. A shadow. At first, it looked like a trick of the light, but as he focused, it became clearer. A tall, dark shape stood motionless at the end of the hallway, just out of reach of his flashlight's beam. "Hello?" Michael called out, his voice trembling slightly. No answer. He took a step forward, his pulse hammering in his ears. As he moved closer, the shadow didn't move, but it felt like it was watching him. The air grew colder, and his breath came out in visible puffs. He took another step. Then another. The shadow seemed to shift slightly, almost as if it was acknowledging his presence. Michael's stomach churned. This wasn't normal. This wasn't a trick of the light or a figment of his imagination. This was something else. He backed away, heart pounding, and turned toward the staircase that led to the upper floor. The light from his flashlight flickered again as he ascended, the wooden stairs creaking under his weight. With each step, the shadows seemed to grow longer, stretching and curling around the corners, as if they were alive. At the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched out before him, dark and silent. Michael's eyes darted from one end to the other, but there was no sign of the shadow. Maybe it had been a figment of his imagination after all. Then, he heard it. The faintest scrape, like something being dragged across the floor. A chill ran down his spine. He turned toward the sound, and there it was again, a shadow, this time much closer, moving along the wall. It was no longer just a dark shape, it had form. It had substance. It was coming for him. Without thinking, Michael turned and bolted toward the stairs. He could hear it now, footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing behind him. He stumbled down the stairs, his flashlight spinning wildly as he tried to escape the growing terror. But the door wouldn't open. It was stuck, as if the house itself was holding him inside. Panic surged through him. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they were almost at his heels. He could feel the shadow behind him, just inches away. He screamed, throwing his shoulder into the door, but it didn't budge. The house was alive, alive with something that wanted him trapped inside forever. Finally, with all his strength, Michael forced the door open and stumbled out into the night, gasping for breath. But as he turned to look at the house, he saw it there, in the window, a shadow watching him. Not his own. Something far darker. The next morning, Michael's friends came to find him. They had been waiting for him to emerge from the house, but when he didn't, they grew concerned. They searched the house, calling out his name, but there was no sign of him. The flashlight he had carried was found at the foot of the stairs, its beam still faintly flickering. Weeks passed, but Michael was never found. His disappearance became just another ghost story, another whispered tale about the cursed house at the end of Maple Street. And yet, late at night, if you listen closely enough, you can still hear the sound of footsteps in the hallway, the scrape of something moving in the dark, and the faintest shadow in the window waiting for the next curious soul to step inside. Creatures watching the night, horror in the woods. It was the kind of night where the moon hung heavy in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the dense forest surrounding the small town of Hillcrest. The trees loomed tall, their branches twisting and creaking in the wind like skeletal hands reaching toward the heavens. The wind whispered through the leaves, and in the distance, the faintest rustle could be heard. No one dared to venture into these woods after dark. No one except Ryan. Ryan had always been the adventurous type, the skeptic. He scoffed at the town's warnings, the old legends of creatures lurking deep within the trees. The stories were nothing more than the overactive imaginations of those too afraid to face the woods themselves, he thought. So, one chilly evening, he decided to prove them all wrong. Armed with only a flashlight, a backpack, and his camera, he set off into the heart of the forest. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the forest grew darker, Ryan felt a strange chill in the air. But he dismissed it as nothing more than the cold settling in. The path ahead was narrow, barely visible in the faint moonlight. The trees were thick here, their trunks twisted and gnarled, and the wind had died down to an unnatural stillness. It was too quiet. Ryan continued forward, his footsteps crunching on the dry leaves beneath him. The shadows around him seemed to grow deeper with every step he took, swallowing up the faint light from his flashlight. That's when he heard it, the faintest rustling, as if something was moving just out of sight. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. He spun around, shining his flashlight into the darkness behind him. There was nothing there. "Get a grip, Ryan," he muttered to himself, trying to shake the feeling that he was being watched. But as he pressed on, the rustling grew louder, closer. Something was definitely moving in the woods. His heart started to race. Was it an animal? A deer, perhaps? He hoped it was. But the sound didn't match the typical noises of wildlife. It was too deliberate, too rhythmic, as if someone was following him. Ryan's skin prickled as the sense of being watched intensified. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, but he refused to turn back. He wasn't afraid. He was smarter than the superstitious townsfolk, right? And then, the whispers started. Soft, low whispers, as if the trees themselves were talking. The words were indecipherable, but the tone was unmistakable. It was as if the forest was speaking directly to him, its voice a gentle hiss that filled the air around him. Ryan's heart skipped a beat. He couldn't explain it, but something wasn't right. He quickened his pace, but the whispers followed him, growing louder, more urgent. Then, a flicker of movement caught his eye. He spun around, flashlight raised, but again, nothing. The forest was still, unnaturally still. Ryan's breath came in shallow gasps now. His camera, once an afterthought, was now the only thing keeping him tethered to reality. He aimed it at the trees, snapping a few shots to capture the night. But every time he looked at the viewfinder, the figures in the woods seemed to move, just out of sight, just beyond the light. He wasn't alone. Ryan's pulse quickened. A cold sweat broke out on his brow as he realized the truth. The creatures from the old stories, the ones the townsfolk warned him about, they were real. And they were here, in the shadows, watching him. Panic set in. He turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush, his flashlight flickering erratically. Behind him, the whispers grew louder, turning into guttural voices, too low to make sense of but undeniably present. He could hear the footsteps now, heavy, uneven, but unmistakable. Something was chasing him, something fast and relentless. Ryan stumbled, his foot catching on a root, and he crashed to the ground. His flashlight fell from his hands, rolling away into the darkness, leaving him in total blackness. His breath was ragged as he scrambled to his feet, heart pounding in his chest. He had to get out. He had to escape. And that's when he saw them. At first, they were just shapes, flickering in the corner of his eye, but as his eyes adjusted to the darkness, they became clearer. Tall, emaciated figures stood among the trees, their eyes glowing faintly in the moonlight. Their skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tight over their skeletal frames. Their limbs were long and unnaturally thin, like they didn't belong in this world. The creatures watched him, unmoving, as if they were waiting for something. Ryan backed away, his legs shaking with fear. He had to run. But no matter which direction he took, the creatures remained in his path. He was trapped. His mind raced, desperately trying to come up with a way out, but there was no escape. The creatures weren't just in the woods. They were the woods. The trees, the ground, the very air around him, they were part of them. Ryan's camera, still hanging from his neck, clicked on its own, the flash illuminating the creatures for just a moment. It was enough. The creatures turned their hollow, empty eyes toward him, and in that brief second, Ryan saw them, hundreds of them, all around him, watching, waiting. They had been here for ages, their existence intertwined with the forest itself. A voice, deep and gravelly, broke through the silence. "You shouldn't have come here." Ryan spun around, but no one was there. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. With his heart pounding in his ears, Ryan took one last look at the creatures. Their eyes were fixed on him, unblinking, as if they were waiting for him to make the choice. To join them. He turned and ran, his legs weak, his breath shallow. But no matter how fast he moved, the creatures were always there, just behind him, closing in. And then, as if the woods themselves were closing around him, Ryan vanished. The creatures had taken him, just as they had taken so many before. His screams were swallowed by the trees, and the forest returned to its quiet, watchful stillness. The next morning, the town of Hillcrest awoke to find the woods as silent as ever. No one dared to venture in, not after dark. And the woods? They waited. Always waiting, always watching. The creatures would never stop. They never had. And they never would. The final revenge, uncovering real-life horrors. In the quiet corners of the world, there are stories buried beneath the surface of history, stories of vengeance, horror, and betrayal that have been forgotten by time, but not by those who experienced them. Tonight, I will take you into the chilling tale of one man's quest for revenge, a journey that led to the unearthing of horrors that could never be forgotten. It all began in the small town of Harrow's Edge, a place so isolated that it seemed like a forgotten relic of the past. Nestled between dense forests and craggy hills, it was a community shrouded in secrecy. No one really knew who lived there, and no one cared to ask. Its residents were quiet, their faces weathered, their eyes haunted. Among them was Henry Blackwell, a quiet man in his 40s, with a thin, angular face and deep-set eyes that always seemed to stare just a little too long. He wasn't a stranger to the town, but he had always kept to himself. A mechanic by trade, he spent his days working in his dimly lit shop, fixing broken-down vehicles and doing odd jobs for the locals. But there was something in Henry's past that made him different from the others, a past so dark that no one dared ask about it. Henry's story began decades ago, with the death of his sister, Emily. She had been young, full of life, and loved by everyone in Harrow's Edge. But one fateful night, Emily vanished without a trace. Her disappearance was the talk of the town for weeks, but despite the frantic searches and growing suspicions, no one ever found a single clue. The local police were stumped, and the case went cold. Years passed, and the town moved on, but not Henry. He became obsessed with finding out what happened to his sister, scouring old records, following leads, and uncovering disturbing details about the residents of Harrow's Edge. What he discovered was not only the reason for her disappearance but the dark, horrifying truths that had been hidden from the public for years. One night, after following a string of cryptic clues, Henry stumbled upon an abandoned house at the edge of town, a house that no one had mentioned in years. It was a decaying mansion, covered in ivy, its windows shattered and its doors hanging off their hinges. Inside, Henry discovered a series of old journals, diaries belonging to the town's founders, written in a strange, archaic script. As he flipped through the pages, he began to uncover a horrifying pattern. The town of Harrow's Edge had been built on blood. The founders had made a pact long ago, a pact with a dark, otherworldly force. In exchange for wealth and prosperity, they had agreed to sacrifice the innocent, to feed the darkness that lurked beneath the earth. Emily's disappearance was no accident. She had been chosen as the latest victim in a centuries-old ritual. The town's prosperity was built on the suffering of those like her. But the story didn't end there. As Henry delved deeper, he realized that Emily wasn't the first to vanish, and she wouldn't be the last. The town had been plagued by mysterious deaths for generations, each one connected to the same twisted pact. The townspeople had become blind to the horror that surrounded them, their memories altered by the dark force that controlled them. Henry's discovery was just the beginning. The more he uncovered, the more the town seemed to fight back. Strange occurrences began happening around him, whispers in the dead of night, shadows moving in the corner of his vision, and people who seemed to know far too much about his search. But he couldn't stop. His sister's death had been part of a larger, more horrifying plan, and he was determined to uncover every last detail. In the dead of night, Henry gathered his courage and returned to the abandoned mansion. As he entered the crumbling building, the air grew thick with a foul, oppressive energy. The house seemed alive, its walls breathing with a sinister rhythm. He descended into the basement, where he uncovered an ancient altar, stained with blood. The walls were covered in strange symbols, and a dark presence seemed to fill the room. There, Henry found the final piece of the puzzle. The ritual had never ended, it had merely taken a new form. The town itself had become a vessel for the dark force, feeding on the lives of those who lived within it. Emily had not died, she had been transformed into something else, something evil. The town had become a prison for the souls of its victims, and Henry had unknowingly become a part of it. As he stood in the basement, he felt the presence of his sister, her voice calling out to him. But it wasn't the voice of the Emily he once knew. This was something darker, something twisted. It was a warning, but also an invitation. A final chance for revenge. The town had claimed his sister's soul, and now it would claim his. But Henry wouldn't go quietly. He set the mansion ablaze, a final act of defiance against the force that had ruined his life. The flames consumed the house, and as the fire roared, Henry realized the truth: revenge was not something that could be won. The darkness had already claimed everything. The town, its people, its history, everything had been corrupted beyond saving. As the flames reached the sky, the whispers grew louder. The pact was broken, and the town would never be the same. But neither would Henry. His soul, like so many others, would remain trapped in Harrow's Edge, forever caught in the cycle of horror and revenge. And so, the legend of Harrow's Edge lives on, a town built on blood, haunted by the ghosts of its past, and forever cursed by the darkness that lies beneath. Endless darkness, chasing shadows in the night. The moon hung in the sky, a pale, sickly orb in a sea of endless black. Below it, a dense forest spread out like an ocean of twisted trees, their branches clawing at the sky, as if reaching for something beyond the stars. The wind whispered through the leaves, carrying with it a chill that bit into your skin, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. The night had always been a place of comfort for Derek. The darkness wrapped around him like an old friend, familiar and safe. But tonight, something felt different. There was a tension in the air, a palpable sense of dread that weighed heavily on his chest. He had no idea what it was, but as he walked deeper into the woods, the hairs on the back of his neck began to rise. Derek had been hiking alone for hours, following a trail that had long since faded into the underbrush. He'd heard the stories old legends passed down from generation to generation. There were whispers of a creature that lived in the shadows, lurking just out of sight, waiting for its prey. It was said to feed on fear, to torment those foolish enough to wander into its domain. But Derek had always dismissed them as nothing more than campfire stories, invented to scare children into behaving. He was about to learn just how wrong he was. The forest was silent now. No birds chirped, no leaves rustled. It was as if the entire world had stopped. Derek felt the weight of the silence press in on him. He took a few more steps, his boots crunching on the dry leaves beneath his feet, and then he saw it. A figure. Just at the edge of his vision, standing between the trees. He froze, heart pounding in his chest. It was tall, far too tall for any normal person. And its silhouette, it wasn't quite human. It was dark, a shadow among shadows, with long, twisted limbs that seemed to stretch and bend unnaturally. Derek's breath hitched in his throat, and for a moment, he couldn't move. His legs were frozen, as though the air around him had thickened into a vice. The figure didn't move, but he could feel its eyes, if it had eyes on him, piercing through the darkness, watching, waiting. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished. Derek blinked, trying to shake off the feeling of dread that had settled in his chest. It was just his mind playing tricks on him. That's what he told himself. But the feeling lingered. Something was wrong. He turned and started walking again, faster now, the sound of his footsteps echoing through the empty woods. The trees seemed to close in around him, their twisted branches reaching out like gnarled hands. The path was no longer clear, and the darkness seemed to stretch on forever. He couldn't remember which direction he had come from, couldn't recall how far he had walked. The forest had swallowed him whole. Then, just ahead, he saw it again. The figure. This time, it was closer. Much closer. Its form was even more distorted, the shadow of its body twisting and writhing in the dim light. Derek could hear a faint whispering now, like a voice calling his name, a voice that seemed to come from every direction at once. It was a voice filled with malice, with something ancient and terrible, and it sent a chill through his entire being. Without thinking, Derek turned and ran. His heart raced in his chest as he tore through the woods, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He didn't know where he was going, didn't care. All he knew was that he had to get away. But the shadow was always there, just behind him, just out of sight. No matter how fast he ran, it was never far behind. The whispering grew louder, more frantic, and Derek's mind began to unravel. The trees seemed to twist and distort around him, as if the forest itself was alive, a living nightmare that was closing in on him, trapping him in a maze of shadows. And then, just as the darkness threatened to swallow him whole, he stumbled into a clearing. The moonlight bathed the space in an ethereal glow, but it was cold, too cold. Derek collapsed to his knees, his hands trembling as he looked around desperately. The shadow was gone. Or at least, he thought it was. For a brief moment, there was a glimmer of hope, a thought that he might have escaped. But then, he saw it again. This time, it was standing at the edge of the clearing, watching him. Its twisted figure was unmistakable, its long, clawed fingers stretching toward him like the hands of a predator. The whispering was louder now, a cacophony of voices, each one carrying with it a promise of torment and despair. Derek tried to scream, but no sound came out. He tried to run, but his legs wouldn't move. It was as if the very air had turned to stone, holding him in place, forcing him to face the thing that had been hunting him. The shadow stepped closer, its form shifting and bending in unnatural ways. And then, with one final step, it was upon him. There was no escape. The last thing Derek felt before the darkness took him was the cold, clammy touch of the shadow's fingers on his skin. The whispering ceased, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, there was only silence. A deep, unending silence. And then, nothing. The forest remained still, the shadows undisturbed, as if Derek had never been there at all. The night stretched on, endless and unforgiving, as it always had been. Somewhere, deep within the darkness, the creature waited, its hunger never truly sated. For it knew that there would always be more fools, more souls to chase through the night, through the endless, unyielding darkness. And it would be waiting, always. Alone in the night, the terrifying secrets of that house. It was a night like any other, or so I thought. I had been passing through a sleepy town on my way to a distant relative's house. The cold wind rustled through the trees, and the moon hung high in the sky like a pale sentinel, illuminating the world in eerie light. As I drove down a quiet, fog-enshrouded road, something about the landscape felt off. I slowed the car and glanced to my right. There it was, the old house, perched on the edge of the woods. Its silhouette was dark and foreboding, with jagged edges and windows that seemed to watch me as I drove past. The house had been abandoned for years, or so the locals had said. It had a reputation for being haunted, though, and as a skeptic, I never put much stock in ghost stories. But tonight felt different. I pulled over instinctively, drawn by a force I couldn't explain. The air around me grew colder, heavier. As I stood outside the car, staring at the house, I noticed that one of the windows on the top floor was ajar. The faintest hint of light flickered from within, like a candle burning in the distance. Curiosity gnawed at me, and against my better judgment, I found myself walking toward the house. The wind howled as I approached the front door, its hinges creaking in protest. My heart pounded in my chest as I hesitated, but something in the house seemed to call to me. The moment I stepped over the threshold, a chill ran down my spine. The air was thick with dust, and the floorboards groaned under my weight as I moved deeper into the house. It was silent, save for the occasional drip of water somewhere in the distance. The house was dark, but that faint flicker of light from the upstairs window guided me. As I ascended the stairs, each step felt heavier, as though the house itself was pushing me back, warning me to turn around. When I reached the top floor, I followed the light into a small room at the end of the hallway. The door was half open, and when I pushed it further, I saw a sight that made my stomach twist in horror. The room was untouched by time, furniture still neatly arranged, curtains swaying ever so slightly as if someone had just been here. But it wasn't the room that chilled me. It was the woman standing in the corner. Her back was to me, her long, dark hair cascading down her shoulders. She was staring out the window, her hands clenched tightly in front of her. "Hello?" My voice trembled, but she didn't turn around. I stepped closer, my breath caught in my throat. A sudden realization hit me. She was no longer alive. Her skin had a sickly, pale hue, and her fingers were twisted unnaturally. The moment I thought to run, she spoke, her voice soft and cold. "Leave, before it comes for you." I froze, my eyes locked on her pale face as she slowly turned toward me. Her eyes were hollow, blackened sockets that seemed to pull me in. A sinister laugh echoed around the room, sending chills through my bones. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me. Panic surged as I scrambled to open it, but it wouldn't budge. I was trapped. The house began to groan, its walls shifting, closing in on me. Shadows moved in the corners of my vision, their shapes distorted and monstrous. The woman's voice echoed in my ears as I ran through the darkened halls. "You shouldn't have come. You can never leave." I reached the stairs, but the moment I set foot on them, they twisted into something unrecognizable. The once familiar layout of the house was now a maze of shifting corridors and rooms that seemed to stretch on forever. Every door led to more darkness, and every window showed the same haunting scene of the woman staring out at me. The air grew thick, suffocating, and I could hear the faint sound of footsteps following me, drawing nearer. But when I turned to face my pursuer, nothing was there. Only shadows. I stumbled forward, desperate for any way out. My heart was racing, my breath shallow, but the house wasn't done with me yet. Each time I thought I was close to escaping, a new horror would block my path. Finally, I reached the front door, my hand shaking as I grasped the handle. With a desperate twist, the door opened, but instead of the dark road outside, I found myself staring into an endless void. There was no escape. The woman's voice whispered one last time, "You are mine now." The last thing I saw was her twisted face, and then, nothing. The curse of the abandoned school, the story of missing students. In a small, forgotten town nestled in the woods, there was an old, decrepit schoolhouse that had long been abandoned. It stood as a grim reminder of the past, its windows shattered and walls covered in layers of dust and decay. The townsfolk avoided it at all costs, whispering rumors of a curse that plagued the school. But no one truly knew the truth until a group of curious students decided to uncover the mystery. It was late one evening when 5 brave teenagers, James, Emily, Mark, Sarah, and Rachel, decided to explore the forsaken building. They had heard the tales of the vanished students, those who had mysteriously disappeared without a trace during the school's final days. The legend was that anyone who entered the school would never return, and the spirits of the missing children would trap them forever. But they didn't believe in ghosts. They thought it was all just a story told to scare children. The group met at the edge of the town, their hearts racing with excitement and fear. The air felt colder the closer they got to the school, an eerie stillness surrounding the abandoned structure. They pushed open the rusted gate, which creaked loudly in protest, and stepped into the overgrown yard. The tall, twisted trees seemed to loom over them, as if watching their every move. The front door to the school was ajar, as though it had been waiting for them. They hesitated for a moment before stepping inside, the heavy scent of mildew and rot filling their nostrils. The hallway stretched out before them, dark and silent. As they ventured further, their footsteps echoed through the empty halls, the sound unsettling in the silence. Suddenly, a cold wind blew through the broken windows, and the temperature dropped even further. A distant whisper seemed to call their names, faint and unintelligible. They paused, hearts pounding, but brushed it off as the wind They continued deeper into the school, their flashlights flickering with each step. It wasn't long before they reached the old classrooms, their chalkboards still covered with faded lessons and half-erased notes. In one room, a dusty old desk stood in the corner, its chair tipped over. But it was the walls that caught their attention. Scrawled in what appeared to be blood were the words, "They never left. You will stay." James laughed nervously, attempting to break the tension. "It's just some sick prank. Someone probably did this years ago." But Emily felt a cold shiver run down her spine. She could almost feel the presence of something watching them, something malevolent. They decided to leave the room and explore the rest of the building. But as they moved toward the exit, the door slammed shut behind them with a deafening bang. The lights flickered and went out. Panic set in as they fumbled to turn on their flashlights. The air grew thick with an oppressive sense of dread. The whispers grew louder, clearer now, voices calling their names, but it wasn't just one voice. It was the voices of children, pleading for help. Rachel screamed. She saw something, a figure, pale and gaunt, standing in the doorway. But it wasn't just one figure, it was dozens of them, their hollow eyes staring, their mouths open in silent screams. They were the missing students, their souls trapped in the cursed school for eternity. And now, they were not alone. As the group tried to escape, they realized the school had changed. The walls seemed to move, shifting the layout of the building. Staircases led to nowhere. Hallways twisted upon themselves. It was as if the very structure was alive, trying to trap them inside. Mark reached for the door, but as he touched the handle, it burned his skin. The whispers turned into harsh screams, urging them to leave. But they were too late. The spirits of the missing students surrounded them, their faces twisted in agony. James was the first to disappear, pulled into the shadows with a final, blood-curdling scream. The others ran, but one by one, they too vanished into the darkness. The school had claimed them, just as it had claimed the others before them. The next morning, the townspeople discovered that the group of teens had gone missing. Their families searched for them, but no trace was found. Only the school stood, silent and waiting for the next group of fools to wander in. Some say the spirits of the lost children still haunt the building, forever whispering their names, urging others to join them. And if you listen closely, you can still hear their faint cries, carried on the wind. The school waits, and the curse continues. The curse of the abandoned school, the story of missing students. In the sleepy town of Hollowbrook, there stood a forsaken building, long abandoned by both time and its occupants. Hillcrest High School, once a thriving institution, now loomed as an eerie relic of the past, its cracked windows and broken doors speaking to the sinister history that had unfolded within its walls. The school had been shut down in the 1960s, its doors sealed tight after a string of mysterious disappearances that left the town in fear. No one knew why the school had been abandoned, but the legends that followed its closure became more chilling with each passing decade. It all began in the 1950s, when a man named Mr. Dalton became the headmaster of Hillcrest High. At first, he was praised for his strict discipline and dedication to education, but soon, strange things began happening. Students spoke of cold spots in the classrooms, whispering voices when no one was around, and shadows that seemed to move on their own. But the most horrifying accounts came from the missing students. One by one, children disappeared without a trace. The town was thrown into chaos, and the police were helpless. There was no evidence, no signs of struggle, and no bodies to recover. The disappearances continued throughout Dalton's tenure, and soon, rumors began circulating that the school was cursed. Whispers claimed that Dalton had been involved in something dark, some believed he had made a pact with an evil entity, while others said the school itself was haunted by the spirits of those who had vanished. Despite the growing fears, Hillcrest High remained operational for a time, until one fateful day, when the final disappearance occurred. A group of students went missing, never to be seen again. This time, the authorities had no choice but to close the school down. The town breathed a sigh of relief, but the curse of Hillcrest High was far from over. Decades passed, and the town of Hollowbrook moved on. Hillcrest High, however, remained untouched. Its doors remained locked, its halls silent, but the whispers never died. Local legend told of teenagers who, in their reckless curiosity, would venture into the school at night. They never returned. In the late 1980s, a group of thrill-seeking teenagers from the town decided to test the legend. They gathered one chilly October evening, armed with nothing more than flashlights and bravado, to explore the abandoned school. They weren't afraid. They laughed at the stories of ghosts and curses. They thought it was all just superstition. As they stepped through the broken gates of Hillcrest High, the air felt unnaturally cold. The school stood before them like a decaying giant, its walls covered in ivy, its windows dark and lifeless. They made their way inside, and immediately, an eerie silence fell over them. The school seemed to breathe, creaking and groaning as if it were alive. It was as though the very building resented their presence. They wandered through the hallways, exploring the old classrooms, each one more decrepit than the last. But as they ventured deeper into the heart of the school, something began to feel wrong. Strange noises echoed through the empty halls, footsteps that didn't belong to them, distant whispers that grew louder with each passing second. It was as if the walls themselves were closing in on them. One by one, the teenagers began to vanish. At first, it was just the quietest one of the group, then the brave leader, and soon, there was only Sarah left. Desperate, she called out their names, but her voice was swallowed by the dark emptiness of the school. She stumbled through the dark, trying to retrace her steps, but the building seemed to shift and change, leading her deeper into its labyrinthine halls. In the heart of the school, she found something that froze her blood, a hidden basement, sealed for decades. Inside, there were old journals, yellowed and brittle with age. One of them belonged to Headmaster Dalton. As Sarah flipped through the pages, she discovered the truth, something far darker than she could have ever imagined. Dalton had been conducting forbidden experiments, attempting to harness the power of an ancient, malevolent force. The students who had disappeared were not simply lost, they were sacrificed. Their souls had been trapped within the walls of the school, feeding the entity that Dalton had summoned. The ritual had gone wrong, and now the school itself was cursed. The entity had grown stronger, feeding off the fear and souls of anyone who dared enter. Dalton's final journal entry was a chilling warning: the entity hungers. It will never stop, and the school is its prison. The curse cannot be undone, but perhaps you can free the trapped souls, or become one yourself. As Sarah read these words, she felt a cold presence behind her. Slowly, she turned, and there it was, a shadow, a dark figure that seemed to crawl out of the very walls. It was the entity, and it had been waiting for her. Before she could react, the shadow reached out, its cold hands wrapping around her. Sarah screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the dark void that seemed to open up beneath her feet. Her flashlight flickered and died, and everything went black. The next day, when the search parties went into Hillcrest High, they found no trace of Sarah or the others. The school stood silent, as though nothing had ever happened. The authorities chalked it up to the dangers of trespassing and abandoned the search. But the people of Hollowbrook knew the truth. The curse of Hillcrest High had never been broken. The entity still lurked within its walls, feeding off the souls of the lost. The school's dark legacy had only grown stronger with time, and it waited, patient and hungry, for the next group of curious souls to wander in. No one dared speak of it openly, but the whispers continued. They said that on certain nights, if you stood outside the school, you could hear the cries of the lost students, their voices echoing through the walls. Some claimed that the shadowy figure still prowled the hallways, waiting for its next victim. And so, Hillcrest High stood, abandoned but never truly empty, a dark monument to the souls it had claimed and the evil that still resided within its walls. The curse of the abandoned school would continue, as long as there were those foolish enough to seek its dark secrets. And The Old Doll, a true horror tale. Introduction. It all started with an innocent find in a small, dusty antique store tucked away in a forgotten corner of the town. I had been searching for something unique to add to my collection of vintage oddities, but nothing prepared me for what I was about to discover. I had heard rumors about the shop owner, Mrs. Holloway, a peculiar woman with a reputation for selling items that seemed almost too real. But as soon as I stepped into her store, something strange seemed to pull me in. It was the scent of old wood, the way the air was thick with time itself. And there, amongst the sea of forgotten relics, I saw it, the old doll. Chapter 1, The Doll's Eyes. The doll was unlike any I had ever seen. Its porcelain face was cracked, and its glassy eyes seemed to follow me no matter where I moved. It was dressed in a faded lace gown, the kind that looked more like a forgotten memory than an item of clothing. I asked Mrs. Holloway about it, and she simply smiled, her thin lips stretching unnervingly wide. "Ah, that one," she said. "It's not just any doll. It has a history." I should have walked away right then. But curiosity is a powerful thing, and before I knew it, I was holding the doll in my hands. There was a strange weight to it, like it was heavier than it should be. It felt alive, almost as if it were watching me, waiting. Chapter 2, The First Night. I couldn't resist bringing it home. The doll sat in my living room, staring at me from across the room, its eyes following every movement I made. I thought it was just my imagination, but the more I looked at it, the more I felt like something was wrong. That night, I left the doll on the mantel. When I woke up the next morning, it was sitting on the couch. I hadn't moved it. No one had been in the house. But there it was, looking at me with those unnerving eyes, as if it had moved on its own. I tried to brush it off as a trick of the mind. Maybe I had placed it there without remembering. But that night, the noises began. Chapter 3, Whispers in the Dark. It started with faint whispers, like a voice just out of reach. At first, I thought it was the wind or maybe the house settling. But the whispers grew louder as the night wore on. They sounded like a child's voice, soft and sweet at first, but slowly becoming frantic, pleading. "Help me, please, help me." I couldn't shake the feeling that the doll was somehow involved, that it was somehow alive. I began to notice small things, objects out of place, lights flickering, cold drafts running through the house even though the windows were shut tight. And then, one night, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of a child crying. I rushed to the living room, but the doll was gone. My heart raced as I searched the house, my every step echoing in the eerie silence. It was then that I saw it, a small figure standing in the doorway. A girl, no older than 5, with hollow eyes and a twisted smile. She was holding the doll. Chapter 4, The History of the Doll. I had to know more about the doll. I visited Mrs. Holloway again, desperate for answers. She was waiting for me, as if she had been expecting my return. "The doll has a long history," she explained, her voice low and serious. "It belonged to a little girl who died many years ago. Her name was Eliza. She was a sweet child, but she had a dark secret. She loved the doll more than anything, but it wanted something in return." She paused, her eyes glinting with something that might have been pity or fear. "They say that when Eliza died, her soul became trapped inside the doll. And now, it's looking for a new owner. Someone to play with. Someone to keep it company." Chapter 5, The Final Choice. The next night, the doll was back in my home. It was sitting on the couch, just as it had before. But this time, I knew better. The whispers were louder, more desperate. "Play with me, stay with me." I couldn't escape it. The doll was inside my head now, and I could feel its presence even when I wasn't in the same room. I realized too late that I had made a mistake, that taking the doll had sealed my fate. The doll had chosen me. That night, the whispers became screams, and I saw Eliza's ghost, her face twisted in agony, reaching out for me with skeletal hands. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. I was frozen, my body unwilling to act, as the doll's eyes gleamed with a dark satisfaction. "Now we can play forever," it whispered. "I'm still here, trapped in this house, with the doll. And I know now what Mrs. Holloway meant. Once the doll has you, it will never let you go. The unclosing window, mysterious beings watching you." It was a quiet evening in the small town of Elwood, a place where nothing ever seemed to change. The trees stood tall and unyielding, the houses clustered close together as if they too had become part of the landscape over time. For most, Felwood was an ordinary town, untouched by the kind of stories whispered in the darker corners of the world. But for a select few, there was always a feeling that something unseen was watching from the shadows, waiting. At the edge of town, nestled between the gnarled branches of ancient oak trees, stood a house that had been abandoned for years. People spoke of it in hushed tones, but no one ever dared go near it. That is, until a stranger arrived in Velwood. Elliot, a traveler by nature, had recently moved to the town. He wasn't one to believe in the old myths or the eerie tales that locals love to share. His interest was more practical. He had recently purchased a house at the edge of town, the one that no one ever mentioned without a shiver. The first night Elliot spent in his new home was uneventful. The floorboards creaked, the wind howled through the cracks in the walls, and yet everything felt strangely peaceful. There were no ghosts, no strange occurrences. Or so he thought. Days passed, and Elliot began to settle in. But something was different about the house, something that gnawed at him in the quietest hours. There was a window in his bedroom that would never fully close. No matter how hard he tried, the wooden frame resisted, leaving a small gap between the sill and the shutter. At first, Elliot didn't think much of it. But as the nights grew colder, the gap in the window seemed to widen, letting the chill creep into the room. More disturbing, however, was the sense of being watched, a sensation that made his skin crawl. He would often glance out the window to see nothing but darkness, but he knew, deep down, that something was there. The whispers began shortly after. Quiet at first, like a distant conversation, almost too faint to hear. But every night, they grew louder, clearer, until he could make out words. "You can't close it. You can't escape." The words were not from the wind. They were from something, someone. The house itself seemed to breathe, as if it were alive, its walls pulsing with the eerie rhythm of a heart beating in the darkness. One night, desperate to rid himself of the growing dread, Elliot decided to confront whatever it was that lurked in the shadows. He stood by the window, staring into the blackness. His hand shook as he reached for the latch, determined to finally close it, to shut out the oppressive feeling that clung to him. As his fingers touched the window, he froze. A shape appeared in the darkness. At first, it was just a flicker, a fleeting glimpse. But then, it grew clearer, pale, twisted faces peering through the gap, their eyes wide and unblinking. The figures didn't move, but their gaze was unmistakable. They were watching him, waiting. Panic surged through Elliot, and he stepped back from the window. His heart pounded in his chest, but the figures remained. There was no escape, no way to shut them out. And then, as if they had been waiting for him to realize, they began to speak, softly at first, but growing louder and more insistent. "We've been watching for so long. You can't leave. You can't close the window." Elliot backed away from the window, his mind racing. The room felt colder, the air heavier. The whispers became frantic, a chorus of voices coming from all directions, as if the house itself was alive, its walls closing in on him. His feet stumbled backward, and suddenly, his body crashed into something soft but firm. He whipped around to see the entire room was now filled with figures, their pale faces distorted in grotesque grins. There was no escape. The door was gone. The window was still open. The beings circled around him, their eyes locked on his every move, their hands reaching for him. They were not human. They were something older, something that had always been there, waiting for the right moment to make themselves known. One of them spoke again, its voice a deep, guttural whisper that seemed to echo in his mind. "You can never close the window. Not now. Not ever." Elliot screamed, but his voice was swallowed by the darkness. The figures reached out, pulling him toward the window that would never close. They were pulling him into it, into the space between the worlds, where no one had ever returned from. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the house fell silent. The window, once cracked open, was now sealed shut. But the feeling of being watched never went away. The town of Velwood remained as quiet as ever, but for those who dared to venture near the house, they could feel it, a presence, unseen, waiting for someone else to move in, someone else to open the window. And so, the cycle continued. The beings, trapped in the gap between realities, watched through the unclosing window. Watching, waiting, for the next soul to step into their gaze. Revenge of the night, the mystery behind a horrifying suicide. There's a saying in the old town of Grey Hollow, the night remembers, and it never forgives. It was a warning whispered among the residents, a cryptic message passed down through generations, but like most warnings, it was dismissed as superstition. The small town, tucked away from the world, seemed peaceful on the surface, with its cobbled streets and quaint cottages. Yet, beneath this peaceful facade, a sinister darkness lingered. And that darkness was about to be unleashed. On the surface, Grey Hollow appeared to be a quiet, almost forgotten place. Surrounded by thick woods, it wasn't a town that attracted tourists, nor was it a place people moved to for excitement. Most people who lived there had deep roots, passed down for generations. The houses were old, the land was farmed by the same families for centuries, and the stories of the past were buried deep, like the old gravestones in the town's cemetery. The mystery began one fateful evening, when the body of a young woman, Eleanor Gray, was found hanging in the old mansion that had been abandoned for years. The mansion, once a proud family home, had stood as a symbol of the town's wealthy past, but now it was nothing but an empty shell. The walls were covered in vines, the windows broken, and the air smelled of decay. Yet Eleanor had been drawn there. Drawn to the house that had long been abandoned, drawn to the dark corners where whispers seemed to linger. The scene of her death was chilling. The rope was tied perfectly around her neck, her eyes wide open, staring into nothingness. But there was something wrong. The expression on her face wasn't one of fear, nor was it one of sadness. It was something much deeper. Something far more unsettling. Her hand was clenched around a small, ancient ring, its surface worn with age, its design barely visible, yet somehow familiar. At first, the town thought it was just another case of depression. Eleanor had been troubled, the whispers said. She had been seen wandering at night, speaking to herself, her behavior growing more erratic as the days passed. But this death, this suicide, was far from ordinary. For in the hours that followed her death, strange things began to happen. The local constable, James Miller, was the first to investigate the scene. He arrived at the mansion, the setting sun casting eerie shadows across the cracked floorboards. As he stepped inside, a cold wind seemed to rise from the depths of the house, carrying with it the faint scent of something ancient. It was as though the house itself was alive, breathing in the night air, watching him. James noticed a strange symbol etched into the doorframe of the old mansion. It was a symbol that hadn't been seen in Grey Hollow for centuries, an occult mark, one associated with the town's darkest secrets. The ring in Eleanor's hand had the same mark on it. As he examined the ring, his fingers trembled. It was almost as if the ring was alive, pulsing with an unnatural energy. Days passed, and soon the whispers turned to rumors. People said they had seen Eleanor the night before her death wandering the streets, her eyes hollow, her face pale. Some claimed she had been speaking in an ancient language, a language no one could understand. And then, there were those who spoke of something far worse. They said Eleanor wasn't alone when she died. They said something had been with her, something that had watched her, something that had led her to the mansion. As the rumors spread, the town began to unravel. People began to disappear. It started with small things, flickering lights, cold drafts, strange noises at night, but soon it escalated. Children stopped playing outside after sunset. Farmers stopped working their fields after dark. And the old cemetery, which had once been a peaceful resting place, became the subject of whispered fear. James Miller, determined to uncover the truth, began to delve into the town's history. What he uncovered sent chills down his spine. Long ago, before the town had settled into its current peaceful life, Grey Hollow had been a place of dark rituals. The town's founders had come from distant lands, drawn to the land by promises of power and immortality. They had worshipped ancient gods, and their rituals involved blood and sacrifice. But over time, as the town grew, these practices were forgotten, or so it seemed. James found old journals, records of people who had disappeared, and even a map of the mansion. The mansion, it seemed, was no mere home. It was a focal point, a gateway between the mortal world and something far darker. Eleanor had stumbled upon this truth, and in her desperation, she had sought the answers buried deep within its walls. But the mansion had its own secrets, secrets that no mortal should ever uncover. It was a house built on blood, and now it was demanding something in return. As James delved deeper, he began to experience strange occurrences. His dreams were filled with visions of the mansion, visions of a woman with hollow eyes, her mouth moving in a language he could not understand. He would wake in a cold sweat, his heart racing, only to find that the symbols from his dreams were burned into his skin, as though someone or something was marking him. Determined to stop the madness, James returned to the mansion one night. He knew what he had to do. He had to destroy the ring, break the curse that had been set in motion by Eleanor's tragic death. But when he stepped inside, he felt the presence of something dark and powerful. The walls seemed to close in on him, and the air was thick with an oppressive weight. As he approached the spot where Eleanor had died, he found something far worse than he had imagined. Her body was gone, but in its place stood a figure, a woman, dressed in tattered clothes, her face obscured by shadow. Her voice was a whisper, yet it echoed in his mind. "You should have never come here." The knight remembers. Before he could react, the figure lunged at him, her hands cold as ice. James tried to pull away, but it was too late. He felt his strength leave him, his body growing numb as the shadows closed in. The next morning, the townspeople found James's body in the mansion. But there was something wrong. His eyes were wide open, his expression frozen in terror. And in his hand was the ring. The same ring that Eleanor had held. And so, the mystery of Eleanor's death, of the haunting in Grey Hollow, remained unsolved. The town, once so peaceful, had become a place of nightmares. And though people tried to leave, the town seemed to pull them back. The curse of Grey Hollow was not just the curse of a single death, but of many, many deaths that had been forgotten, many souls that had been lost in time. Now, no one dares speak of the mansion. The night has become a time of fear, for it is in the darkness that the curse comes alive. It is in the shadows that the town's darkest secrets are revealed. And as long as the ring exists, as long as the mansion stands, the night will always remember, and it will never forgive. Revenge of the night. The night remembers those it has claimed. And those who seek to uncover its secrets will never leave unscathed. The Journal of a Time Traveler's Fear. I never intended to become a time traveler. I had no desire for fame or fortune, I simply wanted to understand the impossible. What if I could glimpse the past, or peer into the future, or perhaps, just perhaps, prevent tragedy from happening? The question haunted me, gnawed at my mind, until I couldn't ignore it anymore. So, I built the machine. It wasn't much, just a jumble of wires, old clocks, and notes left behind by a long-dead colleague. The first test was simple. I would send myself a few minutes into the past, just to see if it worked. The moment I turned the machine on, everything changed. It wasn't like I expected, like the moment of a flash or the shimmering of light. No! Instead, I was swallowed by a sensation like gravity itself had gone mad, pulling me in every direction. The world around me twisted, stretching and warping until I could no longer recognize it. When I opened my eyes, I was no longer in my lab. The sterile, controlled environment was gone. I was standing in a place I did not recognize, a ruined city, a place lost to time. The air was thick, heavy, tasting of decay. The ground beneath my feet was cracked and dry, and above me, the sky was a sickly green, like the remnants of a storm that would never pass. Silence. The oppressive silence of a place untouched by life. For a moment, I wondered if I had made a mistake, if the machine had malfunctioned. But before I could make sense of anything, I saw them, figures moving in the distance, barely visible through the haze. They weren't human, not in any sense I could recognize. Shadows, at first. But as I stared, they began to form, to take shape. Something about them felt wrong. I wasn't sure if it was the shape of them or the way they moved, slow, deliberate, almost predatory. I froze. I couldn't move, couldn't even think straight. A primal part of me screamed to run, but my legs refused to obey. The creatures circled me, staying just out of sight, their forms shifting, becoming more defined with every passing second. They didn't seem to be walking, but floating, sliding over the cracked earth. The sound they made was like 1,000 whispers, layered over one another, each one speaking words I couldn't understand. I wanted to look away, but my eyes were drawn to them, like a moth to a flame. And then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, they were gone. One moment they were there, the next they were nothing but the faintest trace in the air, like smoke evaporating into the night. My heart pounded in my chest as I stumbled backward, panic setting in. Had I imagined it? Was I seeing things because I had jumped too far into the unknown? No. Something told me this wasn't my mind playing tricks. These creatures were real. And I had made a terrible mistake. The following days were a blur. I tried to convince myself that it was just an anomaly, a side effect of the time machine. But the more I used it, the more the shadows returned. I could feel them, even when I wasn't traveling. A presence and awareness that wasn't my own. Every time I closed my eyes, they were there. Every time I tried to sleep, I heard the faintest whispers, like they were waiting for me, watching me. I thought I could control it. I thought I could study the past, peek into the future, and walk away unscathed. But each jump only made things worse. The creatures followed me, growing bolder, more insistent. They were always just out of sight, always lurking at the edge of my vision, like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I tried to keep going, to perfect my method, to prove that I could control time. But with each journey, I felt more and more detached from reality. The shadows became more tangible. I could hear their voices, their growls, their sighs, soft, almost imperceptible sounds that made my skin crawl. Every place I visited, no matter how far in the past or future, they were there, waiting for me. I couldn't explain it. I didn't want to explain it. I just wanted to stop, to go back to a life that wasn't haunted by these creatures. But there was no going back. I had opened the door. And now, they were coming for me. The whispers became louder. They were inside my house now. I could hear them moving around me in the dark, hear the soft rustle of footsteps just out of reach. They were always there, watching me, circling me. I tried to ignore them, tried to pretend that I was still in control. But I knew I wasn't. I was just a traveler now, a passenger on a train that had already left the station. One night, I woke up to find the room colder than usual. I could see my breath hanging in the air, thick and heavy, like a fog of dread. The shadows were closer now. I could feel them, hear them, like they were standing right next to me, pressing in from all sides. I tried to get up, to move, but I couldn't. My body refused to obey. It was as if time itself had stopped, frozen in place, and I was trapped within it. And then, I heard the voice. It wasn't a whisper this time, but a deep, guttural sound, like the earth itself was speaking. Time is not meant to be controlled, it said. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't. The shadows closed in, their shapes shifting and warping around me. I could feel them on my skin, their cold, inhuman presence pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't escape. I tried to activate the machine, to return to my time, but the device, my only hope, was no longer there. It had vanished, just like the shadows. Like time itself, it had slipped away, beyond my reach. I was alone. Trapped in a moment, in a place, in a nightmare that had no end. I stopped using the machine after that. I tried to go on with my life, tried to pretend that everything was fine. But the shadows never left. They were with me always, creeping just out of sight. I could feel them, their presence hanging over me like a dark cloud. They followed me, whispered to me, waiting for me to slip up, waiting for me to make another mistake. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape them. Time had already claimed me, and now it was coming for my soul. I thought I could escape the machine. I thought I could escape the shadows. But there is no escaping time. Time is eternal, relentless. It loops, it bends, it twists. And now, I am part of it. I have become one of the things I once feared. And now, as I write this, I can feel it closing in on me again. The shadows are here. They are waiting for me, just beyond the veil of time. They are always waiting. If you are reading this, you have made the same mistake I did. You have opened the door. And now, you cannot close it. The shadows are coming for you, just as they came for me. You cannot hide. You cannot escape. Time is not meant to be controlled. and it will not forget. The Vanishing Children, A Dark Night's Tale. Chapter 1, The Whispering Shadows. It was a stormy night in the small town of Black Hollow, a place that seemed to be forgotten by the world. The streets were eerily quiet, save for the occasional gust of wind that rattled the windows and sent leaves skittering down the deserted sidewalks. The town had always been strange, but lately, something felt off. For weeks, children had been disappearing, vanishing without a trace. No one knew where they went or why they were taken. But every parent in Black Hollow knew one thing for certain: the darkness seemed to be growing. It began one evening when young Ella, a bright-eyed girl of just 10 years old, heard whispers outside her window. It was a voice, soft, almost sweet, but there was something in it that made her skin crawl. "Ella, come outside, Ella," the voice called. Ella pressed her ear against the cold glass, heart pounding. She couldn't see anyone, but the voice was there, drifting through the night air. She pulled away from the window and ran to her parents, but when they went to check, the voice was gone. The next day, Ella was gone. Chapter 2, The Legend of the Dark Watcher. As the days passed, the disappearances became more frequent, each one more mysterious than the last. Parents stayed inside after dark, keeping their children close. But no one knew what was truly happening, or who was behind it all. The local authorities were baffled, unable to find a single clue. It was then that an old man, known only as the Keeper, arrived in Black Hollow. He had lived there many years ago and carried with him a heavy burden, a dark secret about the town's past. The Keeper spoke of an ancient being, known as the Dark Watcher, a creature that had lived in the shadows for centuries. It was said that the Watcher fed on the souls of the innocent, particularly children. Legend had it that every 20 years, the Watcher would return to take what it needed to sustain itself. And the only way to stop it was to confront it head-on in the heart of the forest where it dwelled. The townspeople were skeptical, but desperation drove them to listen. They gathered a group of brave souls, determined to find the truth, or at least put an end to the horror that plagued their town. Chapter 3, Into the Forest. Under the cover of night, the group ventured into the dense forest at the edge of town. The air grew colder as they went deeper, and the trees seemed to close in around them, blocking out the moonlight. There was no sound, no animals, no insects. Just the oppressive silence, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves underfoot. As they reached the heart of the forest, they found a clearing. In the center stood an ancient tree, its twisted roots gnarled and blackened. At the base of the tree lay a dark, swirling pool of shadows. "This is it," the Keeper whispered, his face pale. "The Watcher's lair." Suddenly, the shadows in the pool began to writhe and move. A figure emerged from the depths, tall and cloaked in darkness, its face obscured by a hood. The air grew thick with an unbearable pressure, as if the very earth itself was holding its breath. The Watcher spoke, its voice a low, guttural growl that sent chills down their spines. "You dare to challenge me? You cannot stop me. The children are mine, and so shall be your souls." A sudden gust of wind sent the group scattering, but the Keeper stood firm, holding a small, ancient pendant in his hand. He spoke a chant in a forgotten tongue, the words echoing through the forest. For a moment, everything went silent. The Watcher froze, as if struggling against an invisible force. But then, with a screech that could shatter glass, it lunged. Chapter 4, The Final Confrontation. The battle between the Keeper and the Dark Watcher was fierce. Shadows clashed with light, the forest shaking with the power of their struggle. The group fought desperately, but it was clear that the Watcher was too powerful. One by one, the townsfolk were picked off, their screams echoing through the trees. Finally, only the Keeper remained, clutching the pendant in his trembling hand. With a final, desperate prayer, he thrust the pendant into the heart of the swirling shadow. The Watcher let out a terrible scream as the darkness around it began to dissipate, its form dissolving into the night. The forest grew quiet once more, but the damage had been done. The children who had vanished were never seen again, their souls lost to the darkness. Epilogue, the town that was. Black Hollow was never the same. Though the Watcher was defeated, the town carried the scars of its darkness. The disappearances stopped, but a chill lingered in the air, and the townspeople knew that the evil had only been temporarily vanquished. The legend of the Dark Watcher became a whispered warning, passed down from generation to generation. And the children of Black Hollow would always remember the dark night when they learned the true price of innocence. The silent scream inside a house's terrifying reality. There are certain places in the world that are forever locked in the memories of those who once dared to cross their threshold. These places are forgotten by time, ignored by the living, and feared by those who know their true history. Among them stands the cursed house at the edge of Windward Hollow, a place so steeped in darkness that even the bravest souls tremble before it. For years, no one could even approach it without feeling the weight of its sinister presence. But what had once been a simple family home, long abandoned and left to rot, was the epicenter of a terrifying and unspeakable tragedy that would haunt the town for generations. The house was over 100 years old, and it stood alone, shrouded in an eerie silence that even the wind seemed afraid to disturb. Once, many decades ago, it had been a proud home for the Norwood family, well known and respected in the town. But after a series of strange and inexplicable events, it had been left empty. People whispered that the house had been cursed, that the walls had absorbed too much darkness to ever be cleansed. But no one knew the true story until a family came to it, looking for a fresh start, unaware of the horrors that awaited them. It was the summer of 1985 when the Henderson family moved in. The family, eager to escape the hustle of city life, had found this old house through a realtor who assured them it was a bargain. Despite its faded charm, peeling paint, cracked windows, and a sagging porch, the house held a certain allure. To the Hendersons, it was the perfect place to rebuild their lives. A change of scenery. A fresh beginning. The family consisted of James and Claire Henderson, both in their early 30s, and their 2 children, Sam, a bright 10-year-old boy, and Lily, his younger sister, only 6. They had no reason to suspect that anything was wrong with the house. In fact, they found it charming, quaint even. The creaking floors and drafty hallways seemed to add to the homey atmosphere. Little did they know, they were walking into a nightmare far worse than any they could imagine. It didn't take long for the unsettling events to begin. On their first night, after settling into their new home, the family gathered in the living room to enjoy their dinner. But as the evening wore on, Claire noticed something strange. A flicker of movement in the corner of her eye. She looked up, but there was nothing there. Just shadows. A breeze seemed to flow through the room, even though all the windows were closed. She shrugged it off. Old houses often had drafts. But then, later that night, as she climbed into bed, the air turned cold. It wasn't the kind of cold you'd expect from an old house. It felt like something more, something unnatural. Goosebumps prickled her skin, and she quickly pulled the covers up to her chin, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling creeping over her. James, being the practical one, laughed it off. "It's just the house settling," he said, trying to reassure Claire. "Don't let it get to you." But something did get to them. In the dead of night, as the house seemed to settle into an unnatural stillness, the children started having nightmares. Sam began to speak of a figure in the attic, a woman with hollow eyes, standing in the corner, watching them. Lily, too young to understand, clung to her brother for comfort, her tiny voice whispering that the woman would come for them. As the days passed, these strange occurrences only intensified. The whispering started. At first, it was faint, a low murmur that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Then, the whispering grew louder, more urgent, more distinct. Claire was the first to hear it clearly, one night when she was alone in the kitchen, washing dishes. She froze, the knife in her hand trembling, as the whisper came again, closer this time. "Get out. Get out now. You are not welcome here." Claire's heart raced, her breath catching in her throat. She turned to the doorway but saw nothing. No one. The house was empty, but the whispers, they were real. James was away on business the next day, and Claire, unable to shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, tried to distract herself by unpacking more boxes. As she opened the attic door, she felt the temperature drop drastically. The air was thick with a tension she couldn't explain. Her steps echoed as she ascended into the attic, the darkness swallowing her whole. It wasn't the darkness that frightened her, it was the feeling. The feeling that something unseen was there, waiting. She stood frozen for a moment, trying to force herself to move forward. Then she heard it, a scraping sound, slow and deliberate, coming from the far corner of the attic. She turned sharply, but there was nothing there. Then she saw it. A figure. Pale. Faint, like a shadow, but unmistakable. The figure of a woman, her face gaunt, eyes blackened and hollow, her mouth stretched wide in a scream that made no sound. Claire's heart stopped. The woman moved, gliding toward her, an unnatural, jerking motion, like a broken marionette. Claire fled down the stairs, her body trembling in fear. She slammed the door behind her and locked it, but the image of that woman, the hollow eyes, the contorted scream lingered in her mind. She knew then that this house was not just old. It was evil. When James returned, Claire tried to explain what had happened, but he dismissed it as exhaustion. "Old houses play tricks on your mind, Claire," he said, though there was a nervous edge in his voice. "We need to be strong for the kids. It'll be fine." But it wasn't fine. That night, as the wind howled outside, the noises grew worse. The children screamed in the night, terrified of the woman in the attic. Sam, his face pale and wild-eyed, claimed that she was calling to him, trying to pull him into the darkness. Lily, shaking uncontrollably, whispered about the woman who had no face, only a mouth that opened wide to swallow them whole. Desperate, James tried to investigate the house, but every time he stepped into the attic, the air grew thicker. The presence in the house was palpable, pressing down on him. Every creak, every whisper, every flicker of light seemed to be pushing him toward the brink of madness. One night, the house seemed to come alive. The walls groaned, the floorboards rattled, and the very foundation of the house seemed to shift. The attic door burst open on its own, and the figure of the woman appeared in the doorway, her mouth wide, her eyes empty. She was no longer a shadow but a solid, horrifying presence that filled the entire room. James rushed toward the door, but it slammed shut before he could escape. The family was trapped. The next morning, the Hendersons were gone. The house stood silent once more, its dark secrets buried deep within the walls. No one in the town ever spoke of them again, for fear that even mentioning their names might stir something that was better left undisturbed. But the house remained. Dark. Hungry. Waiting. Those who dared approach the house after that night tell a different story. The whispers, they say, are still there. Faint at first, but growing louder. The air turns cold, and the walls seem to pulse with an unnatural energy. Those who get too close swear they hear a voice, faint and desperate, calling out in a silent scream. "Help us. We are trapped." And yet, no one dares to listen. The house waits, as it always has. Its hunger never truly satisfied. For in the silence, there are screams that cannot be heard. The shadows of the night, an abandoned hotel's curse. In the quiet hills of an old, forgotten town stood the remnants of a once luxurious hotel, known as the Blackwood Hotel. It was a grand structure, built in the late 1800s, with towering walls of dark brick and windows that reflected the fading sunlight in a haunting way. The hotel had been a haven for travelers, a place of laughter and celebration. But that was decades ago. Now, it stood abandoned, shrouded in whispers of its dark past. The locals, many of whom had never stepped foot inside, knew only that it had closed its doors under mysterious circumstances. People spoke of strange sounds emanating from the building at night, footsteps echoing down the empty halls, soft whispers, and the eerie creak of old doors swinging open when there was no wind. A curse, they said, had settled over the Blackwood Hotel, one that had been cast long ago and never broken. The story of the curse began years before the hotel's closure, with a young woman named Evelyn Winters. She had been a beautiful and ambitious socialite, known throughout the town for her charm and grace. When Evelyn's fiancé, James Carter, a successful businessman, proposed to her, it was the talk of the town. The Blackwood Hotel was chosen as the venue for their grand wedding, and it seemed like nothing could go wrong. But, as with many tragic tales, it wasn't meant to be. On the night of the wedding, a violent storm raged outside. The guests were gathered in the grand ballroom, the air filled with excitement and anticipation. But Evelyn, radiant in her wedding gown, was nowhere to be found. James searched frantically, but she had vanished without a trace. The authorities were called, but no one could uncover any sign of Evelyn. Some believed she had run off, overcome by fear, or perhaps a sudden change of heart. But others whispered that she had been taken by something far darker. They said Evelyn had been the victim of a curse that had bound her to the hotel for eternity. Strange occurrences began happening after that night. The hotel staff reported seeing Evelyn's ghost, dressed in her wedding gown, wandering the halls. Her ghostly figure was said to be seen standing by the grand staircase, her eyes vacant and hollow, as though searching for something or someone. But the most disturbing thing of all was the whispering. It began as a faint murmur, almost inaudible, but over time, it grew louder. The whispers were said to come from the walls themselves, as though the hotel had a voice of its own. Those who stayed too long in the hotel began to hear their names being called in the dead of night, sometimes by a voice they recognized, and other times by something they couldn't place. One by one, the hotel's patrons and staff disappeared. Some say they were driven mad by the whispers, while others believe they were pulled into the shadows, never to be seen again. The hotel was abandoned soon after, left to decay as time slowly consumed it. The curse, however, never left. It was said that anyone who dared to enter the hotel after dark would be trapped within, unable to escape. Some claim to have ventured inside, only to find the building distorted, as though time and space had warped within its walls. Rooms that once existed no longer seemed to be there, while new rooms appeared that no one had ever seen before. The halls were filled with flickering lights, and the air grew heavy with the scent of decay. Many tried to document their experiences. Some set up cameras, hoping to capture evidence of the supernatural. But the footage they left behind was always the same: static, strange distortions, and fleeting shadows just beyond the frame. Some who entered the hotel in search of answers never returned, their cameras and tapes found abandoned in the hallways, their stories lost to time. And so, the Blackwood Hotel stood, its doors locked, its windows covered in dust and grime. Yet, those who dared to come close at night could still hear the whispers, calling them into the darkness. Evelyn Winters, they say, still searches for her lost love, trapped within the hotel's cursed walls, forever waiting for the man she never married. The curse was never broken, and now, no one dares to approach the hotel. The once beautiful structure stands as a silent monument to the tragedy, its shadows stretching longer as the night falls, hiding the secrets within its walls. The shadows of the night are its only company, and no one knows when, if ever, its curse will be lifted. And so, it waits, the cursed hotel, waiting for the next soul to step inside, to join the ghosts that roam its halls. Will you be the next to fall under the spell of the Blackwood Hotel? End. Real horror, the ghost seeking revenge. It was a cold, desolate evening in the small town of Blackwater. The moon hung low in the sky, its pale light casting eerie shadows on the streets. The town was quiet, too quiet, as if the very air held its breath, anticipating something terrible. But no one could have known that this night would mark the beginning of something that would haunt them for generations to come. The story begins with a man named Thomas Gray, an ambitious young lawyer who had recently moved to Blackwater to start a new chapter in his life. He was driven, with a sharp mind and a desire to climb the ranks of society. He wasn't interested in the old superstitions that surrounded the town. Ghost stories, rumors of haunted houses, and strange happenings were nothing more than idle gossip in his eyes. However, there was one story that stood out. It was the tale of the old gray mansion, located at the edge of town. The mansion had been abandoned for years, but local legend said it was cursed. It was said that a woman named Evelyn, who had once lived there, had been wronged by someone very close to her, a man she had trusted. And in her dying breath, she swore revenge. Thomas, curious but skeptical, began to research Evelyn's life. What he found was a tragic tale. Evelyn had been the daughter of a wealthy family, engaged to be married to a man named Victor Blackwood, a charming and powerful figure in town. But something had gone terribly wrong. Evelyn had discovered that Victor was involved in dark dealings with occult forces and had planned to betray her. In her fury, she confronted him, but her anger was met with violence. She was left to die alone in the mansion, her life extinguished before her plans for revenge could come to fruition. The townspeople said her spirit never left, that Evelyn's ghost roamed the halls of Gray Mansion, searching for those who wronged her, seeking retribution. But Thomas dismissed these tales as nothing more than superstition. He was a man of logic and reason, after all. He made up his mind to visit the mansion and investigate for himself. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Thomas set off toward the mansion, eager to prove the old stories false. The journey took him through dense forests, the trees groaning with the wind, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. By the time he arrived at the mansion, it was completely dark. The house loomed before him, an imposing structure covered in ivy. The windows were shattered, the door creaked on its hinges, and the wind howled through the broken panes like a mournful cry. But Thomas, undeterred, stepped inside. The air was thick with dust, the smell of decay clinging to every surface. As he moved deeper into the mansion, he noticed strange symbols etched into the walls, strange and unsettling, like something from another world. He brushed them off as graffiti, but the deeper he went, the more unsettling the atmosphere became. Suddenly, he heard a soft whisper, like a distant voice calling his name. Thomas. Thomas. He froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The voice was unmistakable, and it sent chills down his spine. He turned to see nothing, just the empty hall stretching before him. But then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw a shadow move. A figure, cloaked in white, standing at the top of the staircase. It was her. Evelyn's ghost. Her pale face was twisted in agony, her eyes hollow and empty, filled with an insatiable hunger for revenge. She began to speak, her voice low and chilling, filled with the weight of centuries of anger. You will pay for what he did to me." Thomas tried to back away, but his feet were rooted to the floor. Fear gripped him, and the air around him grew colder. He could hear her footsteps behind him, soft at first, then growing louder, echoing through the mansion as she approached. Her presence was overwhelming, like a heavy weight on his chest. The walls seemed to close in, and the house began to groan and creak, as if it were alive. Evelyn's figure drifted closer, her eyes never leaving him. "You will never escape," she whispered. "No one escapes the curse of the Gray Mansion." In that moment, Thomas understood. The stories were true. Evelyn's thirst for revenge had never been quenched, and her ghost had been waiting all these years for someone to finally cross her path. He was her next target. As he turned to flee, he felt a cold hand grip his shoulder, icy fingers sinking into his skin. He screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the walls. His vision blurred as the darkness closed in, and then, silence. The next morning, the townspeople found the mansion empty. Thomas was never seen again. Some say that Evelyn's spirit still roams the mansion, waiting for the next person to disturb her final resting place. Others say that those who dare to enter are doomed to face her wrath, their souls forever trapped within the mansion's walls. And so, the curse of Gray Mansion lives on, a chilling reminder of the dangers that lie within the darkness, and the price that must be paid for seeking revenge from beyond the grave. The dark that haunts the night, a true scary encounter. It was a dark, stormy evening when I found myself in the small, forgotten town of Ravenswood, a place where the winds whispered secrets, and the air smelled of damp earth and mystery. My car had broken down along an abandoned stretch of highway, and with no other option, I had walked into the town to seek help. Ravenswood was unlike any place I'd ever seen. The houses were old, their windows covered in thick layers of grime, as if the town itself was trapped in a time long forgotten. The streets were eerily quiet, save for the occasional creaking of an old door swinging in the wind. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. My heart raced as I walked further into the heart of the town, seeking out the only lit building, a small, run-down inn at the edge of a dimly lit square. The innkeeper, an old man with a thick white beard and a crooked back, greeted me in a voice that seemed too low for his age. "You're the first guest I've had in years," he muttered, as if the words were foreign to him. "Not many stop by Ravenswood anymore, it's not safe at night." I tried to laugh it off, thinking it was just an odd comment from a man who had lived alone for too long. But as I checked in, a deep, unsettling chill settled in the pit of my stomach. It wasn't just his words, there was something about the town itself that felt wrong. That night, after a quick dinner of tasteless stew, I decided to rest early. The rain hammered against the windows, and the wind howled outside, but I couldn't sleep. The air in the room was thick, and I could feel it pressing down on me, as if something was waiting, watching, listening. At around 2 a.m., I was woken by a soft scratching sound, faint at first but growing louder by the second. It came from the corner of the room, where the shadows seemed to be deeper than they should have been. I told myself it was just the wind, or perhaps an old pipe groaning under the pressure. But then, the sound became unmistakable, the scraping of something moving across the floor. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was pitch black, save for a sliver of moonlight that filtered through the window. The shadows in the corner seemed to shift, and that's when I saw it, two faintly glowing eyes, staring back at me from the darkness. Frozen with fear, I couldn't move. The air grew even colder, the kind of cold that felt like it was seeping into your bones. The eyes blinked once, and then something shifted in the darkness. It wasn't human. It wasn't animal. It was something else, something ancient. I mustered enough courage to turn on the bedside lamp, but the moment the light flickered on, the eyes disappeared. The room seemed normal again, but the feeling of being watched never left. I lay back down, trying to convince myself it was all just a nightmare, but sleep eluded me. The next morning, I asked the innkeeper about the strange occurrence, but he only gave me a knowing look. "Ah, you've met her, haven't you?" he said cryptically. "The shadow that haunts Ravenswood. She's been here long before my time." He told me a chilling story about a woman who had once lived in the town, a woman who had vanished without a trace many years ago. Locals believed her spirit never left, trapped in the shadows that now lingered in the corners of Ravenswood. It was said that she could take the form of anything that lived, and her eyes, those glowing, unblinking eyes, were the last thing anyone saw before they vanished, never to return. As the days went by, I began to notice more strange occurrences. The shadows seemed to move when I wasn't looking. I could hear footsteps behind me, though no one was ever there. One night, while walking back to the inn after visiting a small grocery store, I heard my name being whispered in the wind. "Come closer." I froze, the hairs on my neck standing on end. The voice sounded like my own, but it wasn't. It was colder, more distant. I turned around, expecting to see someone, but there was no one in sight. The streets were empty, save for the flickering lampposts that illuminated the foggy air. I realized then that Ravenswood wasn't just haunted by the woman's spirit. The town itself was cursed. The darkness that lingered in every corner, the oppressive feeling of being watched, it was all part of something much older, much darker, than I had first realized. I stayed one more night, despite the fear that gripped me. That night, the darkness finally came for me. The scratching returned, louder and more frantic than ever. The air was thick with a presence, and I knew, with every fiber of my being, that it was her. The woman. Her eyes were back, glowing from the shadows in the corner of the room, watching me with a malevolent hunger. I didn't wait for her to make the first move. I bolted out of the room, down the creaky stairs, and out into the rain-soaked streets. The wind howled in my ears, and the sound of footsteps behind me grew louder, echoing in the empty streets. I didn't dare look back. I reached my car, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. But as I drove away from Ravenswood, I could still feel her presence, lingering just beyond the reach of the headlights, watching me as I fled into the night. To this day, I don't know what really happened in that town. Maybe it was a ghost. Maybe it was something much darker, something ancient that had been waiting for a long time to make its presence known. All I know is that the darkness that haunts the night is real, and it's far closer than we think. And sometimes, I swear I can still hear her whispering my name in the wind, waiting for me to come back. The Ghosts of Babies, a true horror tale. The mansion had always been a place of mystery. Hidden deep within the woods, its crumbling facade had become an eerie landmark for locals, a place whispered about in hushed voices. But for the Larrick family, it had once been home. A grand, lavish mansion where wealth and power flowed as easily as the wine at their extravagant parties. No one suspected the curse that lay buried beneath the mansion's opulent walls. That is, until the birth of their son, William. It was the year 1883 when Eleanor and Gregory Blackwell welcomed their firstborn into the world. William was a beautiful child, with wide, innocent eyes and a soft smile that could melt even the coldest heart. But those who knew the family well began to notice something strange. While other children cried for their mothers or laughed in joy, William remained eerily silent. His smile, though sweet, never reached his eyes. Eleanor, who had been so excited for motherhood, couldn't shake the unease that settled in her chest each time she gazed at her son. The nursery, once a room full of soft colors and warmth, had become a cold, unsettling place. And though the baby never cried, Eleanor often heard sounds coming from the room late at night, soft giggles, like the laughter of a child who wasn't quite alive. One evening, as the sun set and the wind howled outside, Eleanor found herself standing at the door to the nursery. She had been hearing the soft, tinkling sound of a lullaby, but when she entered the room, she found William sitting upright in his crib, staring at the empty corner. His eyes were fixed on something invisible, a space in the shadows where no one else could see. Eleanor hesitated, her breath catching in her throat. She felt as though the room itself was alive, watching her, waiting for something. But she shook off the feeling and approached the crib, her heart pounding in her chest. "William," she whispered, her voice trembling. The baby's head slowly turned, locking eyes with her. His gaze was cold, far too cold for such a young child. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. And then, for the first time, William smiled, but it wasn't a smile of joy. It was a twisted, unnatural grin, stretching far too wide across his face, exposing teeth that looked too sharp for a baby. In that moment, Eleanor felt a chill, a presence in the room that wasn't her son. She stumbled backward, her heart racing. She ran out of the nursery, slamming the door behind her. Her mind raced, her body trembling with fear. But as she passed the hallway, she noticed something that made her blood run cold, the reflection of a baby's cradle, rocking back and forth in the hallway mirror. There was no one there, but the cradle moved, creaking as though it had a life of its own. A soft, high-pitched giggle echoed in her ears. Eleanor could no longer deny it, her child was not alone. Something else was in the house with them. Something dark, something ancient, and something hungry. The nights grew longer and the house grew colder. Eleanor began to lose sleep, plagued by nightmares and voices calling her name. Every corner of the mansion seemed to whisper, each room more oppressive than the last. She tried to confide in Gregory, but he dismissed her fears as nothing more than exhaustion. "You're imagining things, Eleanor. There's no such thing as ghosts." But deep down, Eleanor knew the truth. Her husband, too, was changing. Gregory became distant, his face hollow, his eyes dark, as though something was slowly taking him, just as it had taken their son. And then, one fateful night, Eleanor woke to find the nursery door wide open. The room was empty. Panicked, she rushed to the crib, but William was nowhere to be found. She searched the house, calling his name, her voice growing desperate, but there was no answer. The silence in the house was deafening, suffocating her with every breath. It wasn't until she stumbled into the basement that she realized what had happened. The basement, cold and dark, was the last place Eleanor would ever go, but she felt an invisible pull guiding her down. She descended the creaking stairs, her heart pounding in her chest. The air was thick with the smell of mildew, and the faint sound of something crying echoed from the depths. As she walked further into the basement, her feet slipping on the damp stone, she saw something that made her blood run cold. A door at the far end of the room, cracked open just enough to see the flicker of candlelight inside. Without thinking, she pushed open the door. Inside, the room was filled with old, forgotten toys, dolls with cracked faces, stuffed animals with missing eyes, and broken rattles. But it was the portraits that caught Eleanor's attention. Painted on the walls were the faces of children, all staring down at her. Some were smiling, others were crying, and one, in particular, caught her eye, a baby with hollow black eyes, a twisted smile, and skin that seemed to melt away, leaving only darkness in its wake. A cold hand gripped her heart, and Eleanor turned to flee, but before she could reach the door, she felt it. A cold breath on her neck, a whisper, low and raspy, almost as if it came from the very walls themselves. "They never leave." The floorboards creaked beneath her, and she turned to see the figure of a child standing in the doorway, William. But he wasn't her son anymore. His face was a grotesque mask of horror, his eyes black as coal, his smile no longer innocent, but something far more sinister. Behind him, the shadows seemed to move, flickering like dark flames. And in the darkness, Eleanor saw them, the spirits of babies, their forms twisted and deformed, their tiny hands reaching out for her. They were hungry for more souls to feed on, and Eleanor was their next victim. Her scream echoed through the mansion as she tried to run, but the house itself seemed to come alive, its walls shifting and closing in on her. The spirits of the babies surrounded her, their soft giggles turning into haunting shrieks, their tiny fingers pulling her into the darkness. And then, as quickly as it had begun, everything fell silent. Gregory found Eleanor the next morning, her body lying cold and lifeless in the nursery. But William was gone. The mansion was empty once again, its secrets locked away, and its curse sealed. Years passed, and the mansion was left to rot, abandoned and forgotten by most. But some still tell the tale of the ghosts of babies. They say that on certain nights, when the wind howls through the trees and the moon is full, you can still hear the soft giggles of babies, and if you listen closely enough, you might feel a cold breath on your neck, followed by the whisper, "They never leave." The mansion remains standing, though no one dares to approach. And in its darkness, the spirits of the babies still linger, waiting for the next unwitting soul to step into their grasp. The end. The fear within, the moment you realized you were truly scared. It was supposed to be a simple night. A night of silence and solitude, with nothing but the dim glow of my desk lamp to keep me company. But the quiet of my apartment, a place I had lived in for years, suddenly felt different. It wasn't the creaking of the floorboards or the hum of the refrigerator in the other room. No, this was something darker. Something that had settled into the very air. I had just finished a late-night project for work when I noticed something odd. A small movement from the corner of my eye. At first, I thought it was the shadow of the lamp, playing tricks on me in the stillness. But the longer I looked, the more it seemed to shift. Like a figure in the periphery, too quick to pin down, but real enough to make my skin prickle. I turned my head, expecting nothing. Yet, there it was, a dark shape standing in the farthest corner of the room. No movement, no sound. It was as though it was waiting for something. I convinced myself it was just my imagination, too much coffee, or a trick of the light. But that voice, deep down in my chest, told me otherwise. It was a voice I hadn't heard in years. A whisper I had learned to ignore after childhood, but now it roared inside me, "Get out of there. Now!" My legs felt stiff, as if they were glued to the ground. I wanted to run, but I couldn't. The figure, still in the corner, remained completely still, like it was not only watching me but somehow waiting for me to make the first move. I turned back to my desk, hoping the moment would pass. The typewriter on my desk clicked loudly, the sound echoing in the empty room. But the air felt wrong, thick and oppressive. I could taste it, something cold, something ancient, something that didn't belong here. Suddenly, the figure moved. A slow, deliberate motion that chilled me to my core. It didn't step forward, but the darkness around it seemed to stretch, like the shape was pulling the very shadows toward it, growing in size, in presence. That's when I realized it, this wasn't just a figure. This wasn't some trick of the mind. This thing, this presence, had always been there, lurking just beyond my awareness, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. I should have left then. But fear does strange things. It paralyzes you, makes you think you can handle it, that you can face whatever it is. But deep down, you know you can't. The figure took a step forward, and that's when I heard it, a whisper, so faint at first that I thought it was just the wind. But then it became clearer. A voice, so familiar, so intimate. "You shouldn't have stayed." My heart stopped. My blood ran cold. That voice, it was my own. But how? How could it be me when I was standing here, frozen, terrified, unable to move? The room seemed to close in on me, the walls pressing down as if they were alive. The shadows on the floor stretched out, wrapping themselves around my legs like cold fingers, pulling me deeper into the darkness. I turned again, hoping to find the light switch, but my vision was failing me. The darkness seemed to expand, swallowing everything whole, and the figure, it wasn't just standing anymore. It was moving toward me, its feet making no sound as it crossed the floor, its shadow merging with mine. "No," I whispered. "No, please." But it was too late. The moment I spoke, the figure lunged forward, its face now inches from mine. It had no features, no eyes, no mouth. just an endless abyss of blackness that threatened to consume everything in its wake. And then, everything went silent. I was no longer in my apartment. I was no longer in my body. It was as if I had been pulled into the very fabric of darkness itself, trapped in a space that defied all logic, where time and space twisted and turned in impossible ways. I was no longer me. I was the fear. The terror, the thing I had always tried to ignore, had consumed me. It had taken root in my very soul, growing inside me until I could no longer distinguish where I ended and the fear began. It was now a part of me, a living, breathing thing that would never let me go. The figure stood beside me, no longer just an entity, but a reflection of my deepest, darkest thoughts. The one thing I had been running from my whole life. And in that moment, I realized the truth. True fear is not something you can escape. It is not something that can be outsmarted or outrun. It lives inside you, quietly growing, waiting for the right moment to show its face. And that moment is always closer than you think. End.